I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away in a green and mountainous land, there lived a young lad called Jon. Jon was an idle, good-for-nothing fellow who had grown very tired of living in his quiet village. He wanted to go and seek his fortune in the big city. He had always lived on his wits, and never very honestly at that. So having no family to speak of, there was nothing and no one to stop him setting out one day on the road that led south. He was not sure which way to go, but he didn't really care. He just took his time. When he was hungry, he stole fruit from an orchard or eggs from a farm. And when he grew tired, he would rest and sit and daydream about life in the big city. He wandered along through a forest, thinking to himself, something will happen if I trust to luck. He was growing hungry again, so he waded through a stream, hoping to catch a trout. But try as he might, the fish were faster than he was. On and on he walked. He was now many miles from his village. At last he came to the edge of a forest where there was a beautiful lake. It was clear and cool and blue, and great rocky hills towered behind it. Jon was wondering just how far he was from the city now, when his eye was caught by a bundle on the ground. It was a bundle of clothes. Looking round to make sure that the owner was not about, Jon quickly picked up the clothes and hurried away into the bushes to change. To his great surprise and joy, he found himself dressed in a priest's robes. Anyone else would have put them back, but not Jon. They fitted him perfectly. And as he looked at his reflection in the lake, he decided he made a very fine priest. What luck, he chuckled. People are always kind to priests. I shall do very well. And he began to practice making blessings as he walked along. After another day's walk, he did at last reach the outskirts of the city. He was delighted, for everywhere he went, he was treated with great respect. People seemed to welcome his blessings. He did find the long skirts of his robe a trifle awkward, but when people stopped and gave him alms, it was all worthwhile. I do like being a priest, thought Jon. I'll never have to work now. Jon certainly wasn't a very honest or honourable man. He was growing hungry again, so it didn't take him long to steal an apple. But this time the owner caught him. "Please don't take that one, Reverend," sighed the man. "It's my best." And instead he gave him one with a bruise. Being a priest, Jon couldn't complain. It was charity after all. He walked on, very excited at being in the city, and was just wondering what to do when a baron came by, and seeing him standing close to the castle gates, said, "Come on, the feast is this way. Hurry up or we'll be late." Jon had no idea who the man was, but a feast meant food, so he followed quickly. Now the baron had presumed that Jon was the new royal chaplain on his way to the Queen's birthday party. The old chaplain had died last month, and Jon looked distinguished enough to be his successor. Jon couldn't believe his luck. Here he was in the castle of the king. But only a week ago he'd been living in that dull little village, always getting into scrapes and being told off by the village elders. Now he was a priest in the company of nobles and being treated with such respect. The food was brought in. Jon's mouth watered as he watched the servant girls carry in large plates of roasted meat. He certainly wasn't going to miss this feast. Even if he was caught, he would enjoy himself first. Suddenly, the whole court made a low bow. Jon was quite taken aback. He could not work out what was happening. But then he saw the reason for their homage. The king and queen had entered. They walked slowly past the courtiers up to the royal table. The king sat, and the courtiers followed suit. Jon found himself at the far end of the table. Now, although it was the Queen's birthday, she didn't look very happy. Indeed, she was very sad, for her favourite necklace had just been stolen. The king was upset too, and he announced to the court, "It is most distressing that my wife's birthday should be spoilt by the theft of her necklace. Let us pray that God sees fit to reveal the thief and make this truly a day of joy. There is a reward for him who discovers the culprit." The court pondered silently on the king's words and then waited for him to taste the meat. The banquet began. There were many meats and fine wines, and plate after plate of delicious dishes was set before the guests. It was truly a feast fit for a king. At first, no one talked very much, luckily for Jon, as they were all too intent on their food. Jon had to keep pinching himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Never, never in his whole life had he tasted such delicious fare. How he wished the village elders could see him now. How he would laugh at their expressions. Jon kept very quiet, for he did not want to give himself away. But he was beginning to feel rather thirsty, for he had finished his wine some time ago. He looked around for a servant to fill up his glass, but they all seemed too busy. Finally, Jon stopped one. "You're just the man I've been looking for. You're just the man we've all been looking for." The servant went very white, and instead of pouring the wine, he spilt it down Jon's robes and dashed out of the room. Jon didn't think a priest should smell of wine, so he quickly left the hall. "What a clumsy servant," he grumbled. "All I said was he was just the man we were looking for." Then who should appear but the servant? "Forgive me, holy priest, I have committed a dreadful crime," he whispered. Jon looked at the servant. What was he talking about? Spilling wine wasn't so great a crime. "It was God's will you discovered me. I stole the necklace," said the servant. And he handed over the Queen's necklace. Jon was most surprised. "Please don't give me away," cried the servant, "for they will surely kill me." But Jon had other thoughts on his mind. "What luck," he thought. "I can use this to gain favor." He sent the servant away and went quickly over to where the Queen's pet monkey sat eating and dropped the necklace into its food bowl. Then he went back to the banqueting hall, hoping that he had not been missed. But everyone was still too busy eating to notice the priest had gone. So Jon walked boldly up to the royal table. Kneeling beside the king, he whispered, "Your Majesty, on praying for the return of the Queen's necklace, I had a vision. Please come." Now the king was very curious when he heard these words, so he rose and followed Jon. And the chamberlain, who didn't want to be left out of anything, hurried along behind. Now the king was so busy thinking about the necklace that he didn't think to question who this young priest was. Much impressed by his vision and his pious ways, he followed him outside. When Jon showed him the Queen's necklace, the king was overjoyed and cried, "Thanks be to you, good priest." Jon watched with great satisfaction as the king and chamberlain took the necklace. "The monkey must have taken it, Your Majesty," said the chamberlain, rather cross that he hadn't found the necklace first. The king was full of praise for the young priest and his vision. They hurried back to the hall where the courtiers were wondering where the king had disappeared to. The king was in high spirits. He marched down the banqueting hall, holding the necklace high in the air, proclaiming that God's will had been done thanks to this holy young priest. The king insisted that Jon should sit beside him at the royal table. He told the courtiers how it was that the monkey had stolen the jewels. The chamberlain was very cross at losing his seat. The Queen was overjoyed at the return of her necklace, for it was her most treasured possession. The banquet began once more with delicious fruits and cheeses. The Queen was now very happy. The day had ended well after all, thanks to the young priest. The king was very keen to reward Jon for having found the necklace. But Jon wanted nothing, just the chance to serve the king and his people. The king was most impressed with the young priest's piety, and he decided that Jon should be made his royal chaplain. Jon was very pleased. That was exactly what he wanted. Now he could live in the palace in great comfort with plenty of good food and rich and noble people to converse with. Never again would he have to worry about how he was going to get enough money to live. Never again would he have to think about work. Well, that was what Jon thought the day he accepted the king's offer to become royal chaplain. But he did have to work. He had to carry out all the duties of a priest. It was all quite scandalous, since he had never been trained. But that didn't stop Jon, and being quick-witted, he learnt quickly. He had to preach sermons in the royal chapel. At first his sermons were most peculiar, for he made them up as he went along. And when he couldn't think of what to say, he would mumble into his robes. Some of the congregation found his sermons very unusual, and others found them distinctly odd. But since the chaplain was such a favourite with the king, none of the courtiers would dare to mention this for fear of being punished. The king had a habit of nodding off during the service, and he never noticed Jon's behaviour. Because he didn't really know what he was doing, Jon often became quite muddled. So that once, when he was marrying a young courtier to a lady-in-waiting, he became very confused, and instead of reading the marriage service, he read the prayers for the dead. The young couple did wonder, and the bride was most upset. Things happened at baptisms too. Jon was very fond of babies, but he wasn't quite sure how to hold them, and he nearly dropped many a baby into the font. But Jon persevered and soon began to enjoy being a priest. He practiced and practiced his sermons until at last he became quite expert. He began to feel true contentment for the first time in his life. He was so busy helping people, baptizing babies, marrying young couples, that he didn't have time to think about himself anymore. All the good advice he gave people every Sunday began at last to rub off on him. He no longer wanted to trick people or steal or do any of the other dreadful things he once would have done. Now he received true pleasure from being able to share his good fortune with others less fortunate than himself. And now he wanted for nothing, so he happily gave away what he had, something he would never have done in his old life. Time went by, and Jon settled very happily into life at the castle. He had his own rooms where he could do what he liked when he wanted. He worked very hard at being the royal chaplain, and he was enjoying himself. He still wasn't quite like any other priest who had been in the castle. Then one evening, when he was relaxing in his room after a hard day's preaching, a servant came to him and said that the king requested his presence immediately in the Queen's chambers. It was very important that he should come at once. Jon wasted no time and hurried away to the Queen's chambers. It happened that the Queen was with child, and since it was to be their first child, the king was very anxious to know whether he would be blessed with a male heir. So this was why the king had called for Jon, since his royal chaplain obviously had second sight, for how else would he have known where to find the Queen's necklace? The king beckoned Jon over. Jon was feeling a little nervous, for he feared that perhaps the king had found him out. "Chaplain, I wish to know if the Queen will give birth to a boy," said the king. "It is most important." Jon was lost for words for a moment. Then he said, "Your Majesty, before I can say anything on the matter, I must retire and meditate. I will have the answer by tomorrow noon." The king was rather cross when he heard this, for he wanted to know right away, and he dismissed Jon rather grumpily. Jon hurried back to his rooms. What was he going to do? He had no way of telling whether the Queen's baby would be a boy or a girl. The king would expect him to give the right answer, and if he were to fail, who knew what might happen? He was bound to be found out. Hour after hour, he paced up and down in his room, hoping for divine inspiration. If only the answer would come to him. But no answer came. Jon felt so miserable he would have to do something. Now where were his quick wits when he needed them? At last, he could delay no longer. Bowing to the king, Jon said desperately, "I fear, your majesty, that the vision wasn't clear. It appears that on the one hand, as though a son would be born, but then, on the other hand, it could be a daughter." This only made the king very annoyed. What kind of a woolly-headed answer was that? He had thought the chaplain to be a man of vision. Jon returned to his room in real despair. How much he had changed from the dishonest young man who had made his way into the castle so many months ago. He enjoyed his job helping others and had no wish to return to his old ways. But now it seemed that the king no longer favored him, and who knew what might happen to him when the child was born. Yes, Jon suffered greatly, and although he performed all his duties well, his heart was heavy. Then one day he heard the sound that he had been dreading for so long, a peal of bells to announce the arrival of the royal child. "Now I shall certainly be dismissed in disgrace," Jon thought sadly to himself. And sure enough, Jon was summoned by the king to the queen's chambers. He went with a heavy heart. He knew he didn't deserve it, but he did ask God to protect him. The doctors were just leaving as Jon entered the room. Humbly, he went over to the Queen and offered his congratulations on a safe delivery. The king said nothing, but came solemnly over to where he stood. Then, wonder of wonders, he embraced Jon. Jon was quite taken aback. "Congratulations, my royal chaplain," cried the king. "Your vision was indeed correct. You shall be created Archbishop." Then Jon understood, for he saw the nurses were each holding a baby. The Queen had had twins, and yes, one was a boy and the other a girl. Jon was overjoyed, and he thanked God for answering his prayers. Everyone was delighted. The king was delighted he had a son, the Queen delighted she had twins, and Jon was delighted his vision had been right after all. In due course, the royal twins were christened by the king's archbishop, now a much respected figure throughout the land, for his goodness and holiness.
I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago, in the land of the Maori, where green forests ran down to a deep blue sea, there stood, overlooking a calm and sheltered bay, a small village. The chief of this village was a kind and brave young man called Kari. He was much loved and respected by all his people, for he gave them good counsel and ruled over them wisely. Kari had not taken a wife yet, and all the young girls of the village hoped he might choose them. One day, Kari called 4 young men of the village together. He wanted them to go with him to a harbour down the coast. His people used this harbour often when they were out fishing. They were to dig trenches there so they might beach their canoes more safely. Kari had also asked one of the old women to accompany them so she might prepare their food while they worked. Early that morning, they left the village and made their way down to the bay. The weather was fine and the wind light, so they knew they would enjoy a smooth crossing. Kari and the old woman got into one canoe with 2 of the men to paddle them, while the other 2 men took a second canoe. The young men paddled strongly, and it wasn't long before they arrived at the harbour. There they beached their canoes. Kari looked about to find the best place to dig their trench. While the men secured the canoes and unloaded their spades, Kari walked over the flat mud until at last he found the right place. The other men hurried over, and Kari showed them where he wanted them to dig. Down and down they dug, deeper and deeper into the mud. They worked on silently, as they wished to be finished before nightfall. There was no time to laugh and joke. They worked on until the sun was high in the sky and they had dug down a fair depth. The old woman had been preparing their food, and at last she called out to them that it was ready. The men were by now very hungry, and they did not need to be told twice. Kari dug down a little further. Then just as he too was preparing to stop, a voice whispered urgently, "Dig deeper, dig gently, and dig alone." Kari, much awed, was obedient to the spirit and gently began to scoop the earth away from the bottom of the trench. He caught sight of something white in the earth. With great reverence, for he was sure it was sacred, Kari cleared the last of the earth away, and there before him he saw a woman's skull. He knew at once that he must not leave it there in the mud. The skull should be given a proper burial. So first he made sure that his men were busy eating and would not see what he was doing. Then he took one of the straw mats they had brought with them, and gently picking up the skull, he placed it carefully on the mat. While his men sat enjoying their meal, he crept stealthily away. Kari hurried into the forest. He knew he did not have time to bury the skull properly now, for his men might miss him and come in search. So he quickly hid the mat under some bushes. Then, having made sure it could not be seen, Kari hurried quickly back to the beach. The men were still lingering over their food. Kari told them to go back to work immediately. Away they went, while Kari stopped to talk to the old woman. He had a special task for her. He wanted her to guard the skull until it could be properly buried. "Guard it with your life," said Kari solemnly. "Wait till I return. Tell no one about it." Away went the old woman, while Kari returned to his men. He and his men worked hard in the trench, but Kari could not stop thinking about the skull. It seemed to keep calling to him. Meanwhile, the old woman had arrived at the clearing where Kari had hidden the skull. She knelt down, and because the skull had not received a proper burial, she duly cried over it. Kari and his men continued to dig until the sun was low in the sky. At last the trench was finished and they could return to their village. While the men collected their belongings, Kari hurried away to the clearing and told the old woman to keep guard and cry out if anyone came. Then he took up the skull and hurried off deeper into the forest. At last he stopped beneath a great tree. There he dug a hole in the sandy soil. When the hole was deep enough, he carefully picked up the mat and at last gave the skull its proper resting place. Gently he covered the grave with earth. He felt strangely peaceful and calm. Then he placed a pile of stones to mark the grave. He would so like to have rested there, but since the spirit voice had told him to keep it a secret, he dare not tarry long. At last he rose up and went to find the old woman. The men noticed that Kari was in a very strange mood. He did not laugh and talk like he normally did. He sat silent and thoughtful, with a faraway look in his eyes. They asked him what had happened, but both he and the old woman remained silent. Once back in his village, Kari grew more and more restless. He did his duty as a chief, but nowadays there was always a faraway look in his eyes. The grave kept calling him to return, and each day the feeling grew stronger and stronger. At last, one morning, he could bear it no longer. He crept away from the village and made his way down to the bay. Though he did not wish to leave his people without a word, the spirit voice kept calling him, and he dared not tell its secret. He knew his people would be well cared for while he was away. He set off in his canoe and paddled out of the bay into the open sea. He felt his restlessness ease a little as he drew nearer to the harbor and the grave. He knew from the moment the spirit voice had spoken to him in the trench that his life had been changed forever. As he knelt beside the grave, he felt at peace once more. Suddenly, he heard the spirit voice whisper, "Stay with me here. Build a hut close by." Kari, obedient to the spirit voice, set to work at once and soon built himself a hut. He had a powerful feeling that this hut was going to be his home for some time now. Not knowing what else the spirit voice required of him, he waited patiently for it to speak again. He waited for a long, long time. He did not mind, for he felt such peace there beside the grave. When he was hungry, he would go down to the sea and catch a fish, which he then cooked over his fire. With cool water from a nearby stream, he needed nothing else. Time passed, and still the spirit voice was silent, but Kari was sure that soon he would know the secret. Then one night, Kari grew very restless in his sleep. He felt strangely uneasy. Though he could see nothing, he felt sure there was someone else in the hut. He turned, and there in the corner, he saw the faint outline of a woman. Then he heard her whisper, "I am she who you buried. For you I have come to life." Kari was filled with awe and wonder as she continued, "I come from the other world. I shall be your wife for 1 year. This is all the time I am allowed." Kari was overcome with joy. All his patient waiting had been rewarded. This was why he had been called back to the grave. He longed to see his wife, and he longed to ask many questions, but he knew he must respect her silence. Kari lived very happily with his spirit wife. Though each morning when he awoke, she was gone, he did not mind, for she always returned to him when night fell. And although in the gloom of the hut he never saw her too clearly, he knew she was beautiful. Months passed, and each day he grew to love his wife more and more dearly. She was so kind and gentle. His happiness was complete when a baby daughter was born to him and his spirit wife. One evening, when Kari had returned to his hut from a day's hunting, his spirit wife appeared. She was holding their child. The child looked like his wife, and he saw that she too was very lovely. He was beginning to wonder why she had appeared when she said softly, "The time has come for you to take our child back to your people." Kari watched as his wife put the baby gently down. He was so happy here in his hut with his spirit wife and his child. He had no wish to return to his village. "Soon I must leave you," whispered his wife. "Our time together is nearly over. Tomorrow you must go. I will be close by." So the next morning, Kari set off in his canoe with his child stowed safely in a basket. And sure enough, his spirit wife stayed close to him just as she had promised. As Kari paddled, he thought sadly how quickly the year of happiness with his spirit wife had passed. At last Kari arrived back at the bay. Some of the villagers were down at the water's edge and were overjoyed to see their chief returning after so long. They came quickly forward to greet him. Kari asked the old woman to come aboard and take his baby daughter. Though his wife was there, she could not be seen. Kari was very happy to see his people after so long. They chatted away with him with all the news. A great feast was held in celebration of the chief's return. All his people were delighted to have him among them once more. He handed his baby daughter over to their care. And though he talked and joked and joined in all the festivities, his thoughts were never far from his spirit wife beside him. The festivities went on all day, and there was plenty of delicious food, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But there was a faraway look in Kari's eyes as he gazed tenderly at what others thought was thin air. How beautiful his spirit wife looked. Suddenly she whispered to him, "I must go soon. Please return with me." And Kari knew that he must leave his people once more. So the next morning, Kari and his spirit wife returned to their forest home and to her grave. As Kari followed his wife through the trees, his heart rebelled at the thought of losing her so soon. She was all things beautiful to him. How could he live without her? Oh, if only she could stay with him. No, he would not let her go. Somehow he must try to stop her. The spirit wife looked very sadly at Kari. "I have to go," she sighed. "Our year of happiness together was the god's reward to you for freeing my spirit." Though Kari stood before her grave, he knew in his heart he could not stop her returning to the other world. "Though I may wish to stay," she whispered, "I am allowed no more time." If only she could stay a little longer with him. "Oh, please don't go. Don't leave me yet." But she just whispered a soft farewell. And with a gentle wave, his spirit wife disappeared. When Kari saw that she'd gone, he was overcome with loneliness and despair. He wept and wept such bitter tears he thought his heart would break. Days and weeks passed, and Kari would not leave. He hoped that one day his spirit wife might return to him. Sometimes he would walk sadly along the beach, crying out her name to the wind. And sometimes he thought he heard her sweet voice call back. But though he waited and waited, she did not appear. Kari became so unhappy. He did nothing but sit in front of the grave all day, hardly bothering to eat or drink, his heart heavy with sorrow. People from nearby villages would pass by and see Kari there alone, and they would come over and greet him. But in his despair, Kari would tell them to go away, and they would see that all he wished for was to be left alone with his grief. When the men returned home to their villages, they would tell their families of their meeting with Kari and how great was his grief. Then one day, as Kari sat brooding, his wife suddenly appeared. And when he saw her, he was overjoyed. She looked so beautiful, but sad. She'd come back to him after all. "Listen to me, Kari," she sighed. "You must not grieve for me. You know I do not belong to your world." "But I will never find peace until you return," he cried. "I cannot return. I have come to tell you that you must now go back to your people and our child. You will call her Pihungonga, the junction, to show that your world and mine has been united in her." A whisper of "go in peace," and his spirit wife disappeared. Suddenly he heard footsteps. Had she returned? He hurried towards them. But instead of his wife, he saw two men from his village. They had been called by the spirit voice to come and take him home. Kari knew that now he must return, so he set fire to his hut, which had been his home for so long. He went quickly away, not daring to look back at the grave. Soon the hut was consumed by flames. As they left the harbor, Kari felt so sad and in such despair at leaving his home, his wife, and the grave. When they arrived back at the bay, he knew he must put all his despairing thoughts out of his mind. He was still the chief of the village, and he must be strong. Leaving the canoe, he strode proudly back to his village. His people needed their leader back, and he'd been away far too long. Kari was just walking back to his hut when he saw something that made his spirit soar. The eyes of his young daughter were those of his spirit wife. Kari lived happily, watching his daughter become a beautiful young woman, and he was no longer alone.